With Path of the Grail, I am wishing to impart to all of you some of the basic highlights and material from my Thothic source that has been given to me through the years, as far back as at least the 1980s. But I'm not going to try to pile all that massive amount of material on you. So I'm really just touching upon certain key core understanding. Now, why is this important, this Grail path? Well, I'm not looking at it here from the perspective of the mythic Grail or the actual King Arthur, which Thoth says did exist, and all of that. Those elements certainly have valid points to them. But what I'm discussing here is what Thoth calls the Grail bloodline and why it's important today. Now, to use a word bloodline sends off all kinds of red flags, I know, but he's not speaking of it as some kind of elitist thing. From the perspective of my source, which I call Thoth, this is something that comes to us from the cradle of our star birthing, and it is available and integrated with everyone on the planet, every human being. Why was it brought to Earth? What does it do? What is the history, briefly, and what is it doing for us now on planet Earth as I speak this in 2022? This story begins, or at least our part of the story begins, with Lord Melchizedek, a star kindred being from Venus, which is our guardian planet. So it is a streaming that comes from the blue star Rigel, but the Venusians have their own signature in all of this. And when we speak of Venusians, we're not speaking of what the satellites are showing us, the probes are showing us, the pictures that are coming back from all of that. This is gas and swirling stuff. We're talking about the true core dimension of Venus. So it's another dimensional field. This whole topic careens off into quantum science, the holographic universe, and how all of that works. So we're not going there right now. But suffice to say that Venus and Earth, the consciousness, the soul connection, comes from the blue star Rigel in Orion, unlike the other planets in the solar system. And so Venus is a thriving world in its own right, but we can't see it that way because we're looking at it and traveling to it in our own dimension. So we come back to our Lord Melchizedek, who arrived from Venus. And this was in a very ancient time in Lemuria, or what Thoth prefers to call Mu. Now I'm going to read to you from some of my material in the Grail Alpha through Omega 1998 Temple Doors issue. According to Thoth, the name Melchizedek can be used to refer to two different entities. The first being the greater universal Melchizedekian archetype as a composite being beyond the vibration of what we understand as a soul. Secondly, there is the Lord Melchizedek, who was an ensouled yet illumined entity. This latter is the being Thoth claims as one of his previous incarnations, and will be the one we refer to herein. When the Lord Melchizedek came from Orion through the portal of Venus to ancient Lemuria, or Mu, he brought the archangel crystal, also known archetypally as the Philosopher's Stone, with him to Earth. It contained the vibrational imprint or template of higher wisdom concerning the Christ consciousness and its destined patterning in this planetary sphere. Through the eons, the etheric level of the planet fell forcing the archangel crystal to be taken up from this dimension. Now, there was a lesser version of the archangel crystal. By lesser, I mean one that can still exist in this dimension. It's very small by comparison, but it is sort of a hosting crystal, you might say, for the greater one in the other dimension. According to Thoth, this secondary crystal, or hosting crystal, is currently kept in a small cup inside an ox-shaped box, and now rests in a chapel on the Avalonic star island of Iovia, on the other side of the etheric veil. So this one has apparently left our dimension as well, but it's not quite as far removed. There are different stages of dimensional experience, and this one is still very close to us. Through the years, Thoth has given me a great deal of information on the archangel crystal and its relevance to us on planet Earth. This is a whole other topic again, so we're going to stay focused on the Grail path of the blood lineage and what that means to us today. The Lord Melchizedek held the living vibration of Christic consciousness within his blood. Thus, one of the major components of Melchizedek's intended earth mission was to create generational Grail blood lineages in this planet's genetic streaming, thereby infusing lost light codes into the genetics of mankind. In a later age, Yeshua, the host for the Christ incarnate, would spring from the vine of Melchizedek to revivify these codes and take them into a new octave of experience. It was a direct result of the greater divine plan that the pure Solarian genetics of the Lord Melchizedek were inseminated into 12 carefully selected and prepared female initiates, who then each birthed a child as a result. We must keep in mind that even though the fall, quote unquote, had already occurred, that is, the vibrational connection from the light inscription had been disoriented, the consciousness of those souls embodied on the earth at that time were still operating at a high enough level in the spectrum of vibration to keep such an act of perpetuation in the context of its sacred and divine purpose. This was especially so for those women who were chosen and carefully prepared for this role, as they were high initiates of the Lord Melchizedek himself. I'd like to pause here and say that this whole impregnation was done vibrationally and not through physical copulation as we know it today. This vibrational insemination was what was conducted between the Virgin Mary and the angel to birth Yeshua, or Jesus as he's called. The souls of those first 12 children who were born as a result of this sacred creational process were also chosen by the spiritual hierarchy to ensure the success of the first generation of Melchizedek. These original 12 lineages were perpetuated through the Lemurian experience until its latter days as a nation. However, while it was in ancient Lemuria that the Christic Grail was originally seated by Melchizedek, the true format of a Grail mystery was not actually created until ages later in Atlantis. From the record of Thoth, the following outline is revealed. During the cataclysmic destruction of Lemuria, which occurred over a long period of time, the remaining descendants of the Lord Melchizedek migrated to Atlantis. When Lemuria began to falter as both a nation and a landmass, the few remaining generations of Melchizedek came to Atlantis with the purpose of creating and perpetuating the Grail mystery for the future of mankind. These Melchizedekian descendants were the first Grail families. Once they reestablished themselves in Atlantis, these Grail-born designated a Grail priest king or a priestess queen for each of the 12 Melchizedekian family branches. Each of these 12 kings/queens established temple communities in Atlantis for their family tribe. In the perception of that age, this was not seen as an act of elitism, but as a means to preserve genetic consciousness which could be accessed through these family tribes for the good of all inhabitants of the world. Between the arrival of the first Grail family tribes from Lemuria and the final demise of Atlantis was, of course, a period of many tens of thousands of years. Consequently, there were many Grail-born who assumed a seat in one of the 12 positions during that length of time. It was an age in which human beings, especially Sunborn, had lifespans of many hundreds up to even 2,000 years. All Sunborn have a certain amount of ultra-terrestrial, or what I'm calling now star kindred, genetic lineage, as did the Grail lineages through Lord Melchizedek. Sunborn came from the bloodline lineage of the most ancient star races that came to Earth in several migrations beginning in the Hyperborean epoch. The Grailborn came out of the Sunborn of the Melchizedekian lineage begun in the Eros epoch. Now, this is referring back to information received by me from Thoth from years ago. This is the conundrum of working with my material, or trying to convey to you something briefly, because it's all sewn together. History upon history upon history. So Thoth will refer back to something like the Eros epoch. Well, that's been discussed previously in my material, but we can't go back and discuss it now. So you're going to have to kind of surf with me along these lines. But I will say that the Sunborn, the Sun, the Solar, the Solarian, this all refers to the fact that we are all solar beings. And then Thoth gives me the first 12 Grail priest kings and priestess queens of Atlantis. Well, he names them here, and I'm not going to go through that, but I'm just going to say that he did do that. And he says, in addition to their individual temple communities, the Grail kings and queens established a central gathering place where the 12 would come together for decision-making crucial to the perpetuation of their family tribes. Also, to enter high states of synergic awareness in order to aid in the re-spiritualization of the planet Earth. All of Atlantis held the Grail priest kings and queens and their family tribes in high esteem. These were not kings and queens who attempted to actually govern the people of Atlantis, or previously the people of Lemuria. They were given this title to acknowledge them as persons who carried the royal blood of heaven for all of Earth's kind in their evolutionary service to Source. They were men and women who lived their lives in service to God through humanity. Thus they came together reverently to assist the world condition in its return to Source. The service of these priest kings and priestess queens was more than a homage of faith. They were capable of traveling through the inner world portals and communing with illumined beings of other stars and dimensions. Their purpose was that of spiritual magicians who used their superior powers selflessly to promote the Christic presence in the world. The gathering place of the Grail kings and queens was a rather simple circular building called the Sarhanak, meaning the dragon star. It was named thusly because Melchizedek was known as the dragon star, the one who came upon the fiery breath of the dragon to earth. This was the ancient description of the brilliant Merkaba that descended to earth, transporting the being Melchizedek from Venus to this realm, a story which was still remembered and told after all those ages had passed. However, I will also add there's a little more to it than that. This has to do with the dragon beings, not lizard beings or anything like that. We're not talking about Anunnaki here. We're talking about the in-breath and out-breath of the deep resonance of the galaxies. This is called the dragon breath. And the beings that came forth from that dragon breath were known as dragon lords at certain points in time on this planet. Thoth was one of them. Melchizedek was another. The inside of the Sarhanak was composed of two concentric circles, the first being a narrow hall width around the circumference of the second. This outer circle was the hall of generation, within which was inscribed the history of the Melchizedekian generations. There were also niches in this hallway provided for talismans and other objects of sacred significance to the Grail families. Positioned in the center of the large inner circle was the Mobad, or crystal round. This was a large 12-faceted table made of pure quartz crystal. Inside the crystal were thin wisps of plant forms known as Maia. This plant was one of the ancient survivors of another era when plant life was more highly developed and sensitive to the energies of spirit. The Maia lived entirely on the piezoelectric currents created by pressures within crystal and rock in the earth. Thus they could be found attached to rocks and often inside cracks within stones. They often grew inside crystals as they were forming. The Maia were especially fond of crystals. They responded to any piezoelectric currents running through the crystal by discharging light from their hair-like tendril forms. Sealed in transparent crystal, the Maia resembled golden fern-like angel hair that came to life, firing illumined charges through the crystal when the high-level sentient minds of the Grail priest kings and priestess queens interacted with the crystal the Maia was embedded within. The high-level thought energy of these kings and queens triggered the same response as the piezoelectric currents of the earth within the Maia. Although an impressive sight, there was much greater purpose for the Grail-born having created their Mobad from quartz containing this miracle plant. When the wispy tendrils trapped in the crystal table lit up, they also opened an etheric channel in their immediate proximity, which cleared away all astral density and thus lesser astral forms, thereby providing a stronger threshold of attunement to the higher levels of the other world. Upon the surface of the Mobad were carved 12 sacred symbols representing the 12 thresholds of the Mazzaroth, the command thresholds of the zodiac, with the 13th Mazzalothic portal beyond the Mazzarothic zodiac, represented by a symbol in the center of the table. These inscriptions were inlaid with gemstones. In their otherworld work, these Grail kings and queens entered various channels of light pathing attuned to one or more of the Mazzarothic thresholds. The Mobad was programmed to accommodate them in this passage. I pause in the reading for a moment to say that it was literally impossible for me to recreate that table or find it in a web search. So you're not seeing here anything resembling it, really. But it has some kind of an essence, some kind of a feel to it. I didn't just want to have a blank screen. It is unfortunate that it is not within my powers to simply imprint it from my mind into this video. The Sarhanak housing the Mobad of the Grail-born was situated on the Atlantean Isle of Ruta in a small alpine valley nestled between three mountain peaks, Umar, Talichet, and Moria. These three peaks were called the children of Zor. Zor was the eagle god, or more aptly, according to the belief of the Atlanteans, the dive, or nature power of high places. Ruta was the portion of Atlantis that did not succumb to the sea in the final deluge which swept the rest of the continent asunder. Instead, Ruta, like Brigadoon, ascended into another electromagnetic zone of the earth, where it remains to this day. Although the Grail priest kings and priestess queens had already departed Atlantis by the time of Ruta's ascension, one of the guardians of the Sarhanak remained. Removed from the effect of time as we understand it, this guardian is still in attendance at the Dragon Star. His name is Chesed, also known as the Eternal Watcher. It was he whom Hestor, Merlin's father, visited in his otherworld journeys. This being also became the guide of both Merlin and Arthur. Thus the Grail families and legends were underway long before King Arthur and his round table of Grail Knights. Much of those legends, however, find their roots in the tales of the early Grail priest kings and priestess queens, as is witnessed by the Round Table itself. As we will see, these Grail lineages continued on in a somewhat altered form after the demise of Atlantis. In the remaining age of that great civilization, another migration began, which allowed the Grail blood lineages to be perpetuated on Earth elsewhere. Out of the Atlantean migrations of the Grail-born began the Grail family of the Mazur, with its many subfamilies. The Mazur were a more diverse mixture of genetics than the original Atlantean Grail kings and queens and their family tribes, but they carried the same Melchizedekian blood consciousness. This blood consciousness had descended in an unbroken lineage to them from the Atlantean Grail-born, who had carried it forth from Lemuria and the Lord Melchizedek. After the Atlantean deluge, the Mazur Grail lineages continued primarily in an informal way without any hierarchical structure for several thousand years. During this period, the Mazur worked to collect the scattered remnants of their purest blood lineage after having migrated to the region of Nova Scotia. They then migrated as a collected group to the British Isles and later dispersed throughout the European and Asian continents. Again, I wish to pause in the reading for a moment. It was later, after I wrote this, that I also found in the Akasha there was a group of the Mazur who did not go to Nova Scotia, but went directly to the Canary Islands. And from there, they went into the Basque country of France and continued on. Many did in different locations of the planet. But so there was two strains. One went to Nova Scotia and another went directly to the Canary Islands. About the year 61,000 BC, the nomadic Mazur went through the recollection process once again. They were able to gather the descendants of the primary and purest blood lineages and reestablish the formal succession of the Grail-born through 16 priest kings who had been chosen for their unbroken ancestral lineage from Melchizedek. The location of the gathering they held to revive the royal house of the Grail was in the region of Montserrat, Spain. It was here where one of the two main Grail castles would be established later. By the time of this latter Mazur gathering, little in the way of written records remained to guide them in choosing the Sarhanak, as the Grail kings were then called. This was a term implying an elect destiny through direct descendancy from the house of Sarhanak, the Dragon Star. Indeed, the whole tribe would claim a direct descendancy from Melchizedek. However, the original Grail kings and queens of Atlantis had been chosen from among the Grail-born through the inner vision of their tribal family seers, with the offspring of the chosen ones inheriting the right to ascendancy through them. Thus the Mazur decided to rely upon this ancient method, and their wise ones were given vision as to the identity of the 16 priest kings for the post-Atlantean Grail hierarchy. No women were chosen this time, For with the fall of the Melchizedekian temples in Atlantis, the feminine power had assumed the role of being veiled within the planetary experience. The women were still oracles, but they had become shrouded in the mists. Like wounded creatures of the forest, most females chose to wield their power in less visible forms after Atlantis, although there were certainly some outstanding exceptions to this rule throughout history. 16 priest kings were chosen instead of 12, for each priest king must come from one of the remaining Grail subfamilies, which in the Mazur had expanded from 12 to 16 by this time due to some interbreeding between the lineages. From the tribe of Kuthmaris originated the Olai, taking their name from the ancient Olami, or the Sunbow clan, who were the first master builders, having descended to Earth before Melchizedek began his generation on the planet. From the tribe of Olai came the Grail priest king known as Hanukat Umera, meaning Lord of the Rising Sun. It was he who led his tribe into Egypt, where his Mazur ancestors had established rulership around 4000 BC. They had left guardianship of their Egyptian kingdom in the hands of a native people who did not wish to return it to Hanukatumera. Eventually, the Olai did regain their rulership of the Egyptian lands and were known as the Hyksos, or shepherd kings, until they were overthrown and cast out of Egypt in the 15th century BC. They were also known as the Pale kings. Thoth reveals that this meant the pale kings, as they were pale-skinned and fair, and being those who were from the pale or dimly lit stars, meaning the very distant stars in the sky. We find through Akashic investigation the following. Egypt was originally intended to be the place where the Anointed One, the Christ, would incarnate in word, flesh. Because the people rejected the shepherd kings, who were the Grail bearers, the priests of Melchizedek, who were the Grail priests of Mazur through the Olai, were forced to establish a new kingdom, actually a secondary Holy Land, in what would become Jerusalem. From this base they continued the sacred rites of the dove, the secret code symbol of the Christ, having been used by the Mazur since the days of Atlantis. The Mazur were more than just Grail-born, however. Their lineage also carried the genetic seeds of the 30 spirit tribes. These seeds are very high-level endogenetic information, which is held within the area of the heavens, Thoth refers to as the Vault of Osiris. Thoth has previously given information on the 30 spirit tribes and their connection to the Mazur. And he states, out of the star in genetics in the heavenly vault of Osiris are formed the body parts of the Adam Kadmon, of which Osiris represents an evolutionary aspect. These parts are integrated into the genetics of the human race through 38 strands of recursive stellar information within the human etheric genetics or paragenetics. These strands are the sterilium. 30 of these strands, or sterilium, have nested in the descended earth through the 30 spirit tribes. The remaining 8 strands compose the stellar configurations of soul frequency bandwidths involved in the higher evolution of this planet, which continues to exist in advanced DNA templates of the Adam Kadmon. Such beings as Thoth are from these templates. These people contained the genetic and paragenetic seeds for the entire 30 spirit races of mankind, which when brought together with the remaining 8 advanced sterilium or strands will form a physical vehicle for the regenerated Adam Kadmon. I'd like to pause here and say this regenerated Adam Kadmon, which is the blueprint for humanity on Earth, will be the translated form of the pure gem body in the new Earth star. The Hyperboreans contained Syrian blood, but this particular Hyperborean family within the greater race also held the genetic codes of the 30 spirit races through a mixture of 5 tribes. Thoth names these as Lemurian, Atlantean, Noachian, Hokamai, and Katumi. In the Keys of Enoch by J.J. Hertog, they are defined as Enochian, that would be the Lemurian, Sethian, the Atlantean, Noachian, being Noachian, just a little bit differently spelled, and Davidic, which is Hokamai. Thoth then adds Canaan to correlate with his Katumi. The Syrian genetics of the Hyperboreans included a special gene that allowed the blending of DNA with various other universal families. It also accelerated the process of DNA aggregate assimilation, which is the associative bonding of like DNA hologramic fields. Through this DNA assimilation, the true evolution of a species occurs. However, the Hyperborean strain was not pure Syrian, but a blend of that stellar race with earthen genetics. Thus, it operated under certain handicaps which were not revealed at the time. There were 2 more star races within these northern people, the Orinian and the Pleiadian. The people who carried the gene strands of the 5 earth families and 3 star races were originally called the Mazur. As they began their nomadic journey, they traveled through many lands. A branch of the Mazur became the Tuatha De Danann. I will be discussing the Tuatha De Danann in a future video of this series. Other branches occurred through the centuries, but the greater body of the Mazur had the blood of many races flowing through their veins, including the Celts eventually. By that time, the Danann branch had rejoined to some extent with the Mazur after the former had entered the realm of the She-Feri. Thus, the Hebraic bloodlines via the tribe of Dan and the She-Feri were commingled with the original Mazur lineage. After this had occurred, the Mazur had the full cauldron of genetic Grail information within their keep. They were the true inheritors of the Sangreal, the Grail bloodlines. It was from this bloodline that the Christ, as Yeshua, would come forth through the house of David, a direct Mazur descendancy. This concludes part 1 of the Grail Path. Thank you for listening.